All right, class. I decided to leave the cave today and travel all the way to Pennsylvania to the Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was ratified and all that. Yeah. No, of course I'm not. I'm just using a little bit of video trickery. But it would be cool, right? It's some place I haven't been yet. It's on my to do list. But this lecture is called I'll Do It My Way, and it's about how the Declaration of Independence came about. So we're going to talk about this 13-year period after the French and Indian War until the independence was declared in July of 1776. So we have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of stuff's happening. So I want you to already be thinking about the campfire illustration that I used in a previous lecture, that throwing logs on a campfire at a sort of small pace keeps the fire relatively small, and that's what's been done. But between 1763 and 1776, the logs are going to be coming fast and heavy, and so this little campfire is going to turn into a bonfire, and it's going to explode in the face of the British. And so several things to begin thinking about as we talk about feeding the fire here. First, and if you will go back to previous lecture, you remember the proclamation line that was drawn on a map in 1763. So if you look at the map that showed the French, the North America before the war and North America after the war, you notice after the war this line was drawn, and it was basically drawn down the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains, down the center of it. And what that proclamation line did immediately, as soon as the war was over, there was victory. Remember, everyone's happy. At least the Americans are happy. The British are happy. They drafted the proclamation line and put it in place, which prevented you, a colonist, from going into the Ohio Valley. And you may say, what? What's that about? Well, remember, the whole point, the whole reason the French-Indian War started was because American colonists were going into the Ohio Valley. Again, men like George Washington and others who went to buy land and to make it saleable to other people. That's how they would make money. They then fought a war over it with the French. They defeated the French, and then now their own government tells them, sorry, you can't go in there. Well, the reason the government did that was because they also needed Indian allies. Again, we call the war in America this French-Indian War, referring to the French and their Indian allies. The British also have allies, and one of the things they promise is if they help, and when the British win, they will promise to leave them alone. They will make their territory basically off limits. And the Indians sign on for that. And so when the war ends, the British actually move to enforce that. And that is the proclamation line. So essentially, you are no longer allowed to move or to travel or to even really do business in that Indian territory without very special permission. And this made a lot of the colonists very, very angry, because many had already moved into that region, and guess who comes and tells you that you have to leave? You don't get a letter in the mail. You get a nice visit by the British Army, and they come by and they tell you nicely to move. And if they come back a second time and you haven't moved, then they will not so nicely force you to move. And that creates, again, a lot of animosity toward the British. That's one of the things that starts to develop during this period of time, is there's a lot of animosity toward British troops, because the uniform is a symbol of tyranny. When you watch one of the first couple of videos in the video directory, the documentaries, you'll see that they talk about this. The uniform becomes the symbol of tyranny. It's like living in Killeen, where we have 50-some thousand army personnel, and seeing them running around in their uniforms. If that was a hated uniform, you hated them. Just imagine how difficult it would be to live in this town. So the proclamation line is one big log that's thrown on the fire. People are unhappy about it. But previously, enough time had been seemingly given before the next log was thrown on the fire. So that log burns down, and then the new log gets thrown on the fire. But between now and 1776, they're just going to start dropping these new logs on the fire, one after the other. And I just put a few here on the list to talk about, but there are many. And so, right on the heels of the Proclamation Line, everyone's still very angry about the Proclamation Line. The Sugar Act gets passed, which is a tax on sugar and coffee and things like that. Things, basically, the way to think about it is things that you need, things that you use that you can't produce yourself. You can't buy locally. They have to be imported in from somewhere else. So there's a tax on that. And what that means is it costs more. And that makes people mad. And people start boycotting and trying to do different things. So the challenge of the Sugar Act is there's really not a huge reaction. People are angry, but they're angry separately. And separately, they're not really going to be able to accomplish too much. Well, again, you can see on the screen here, on the heels of the Sugar Act, so people are still angry about the Proclamation Line. Now they're angry about the Sugar Act. Then the Stamp Act gets passed. And the Stamp Act is like a direct tax. If you buy a newspaper, you got to have this stamp stuck on it, and that costs money. If you buy, all kinds of printed material, contracts, you name it. And this is going to affect businessmen tremendously. And so this is going to start getting people kind of together, and that's what needs to happen before anything serious can happen. And so a couple of things come out of the Stamp Act. It's hugely unpopular. And in fact, it's one of the least successful taxes that they actually levied. Think about it. Everyone, especially in New England, but pretty much across the colonies, buys newspapers on a regular basis. That's how you get all of your information. That's how you catch up on all the news. That's how you figure out what the weather is going to be. That's how you get crop prices or land prices and so on. That's how you read about the sermon if you missed it on Sunday. I mean, everything's in there, plus news from Europe and around the world. It's all in there. And so everyone reads. And so now that the newspaper costs more, this is going to make everyone angry. So two things kind of come out of this. One is the Stamp Act Congress, which is basically, I would think of it more as a think tank. It's Samuel Adams and some others trying to get this thing repealed, and eventually the Stamp Act does get repealed because it's so unpopular. But I would want you to kind of think of it more in terms of a think tank. These are a bunch of guys who are paid or who are getting together to figure out how to deal with this situation of all these taxes and whatever. And they're not trying to foment rebellion. They're trying to protect their rights as they see them. So what happens is they'll meet together and they'll have discussions and they'll actually write things down, and they'll actually send this information out to some of the other colonies. And then you have the Sons of Liberty, which Sam Adams also is involved in, and that is a group of people dedicated to preventing these kinds of things from happening. And sort of the end result is that, long story short of that, is people are going to riot. People are going to cause real problems in places like Boston and New York and port cities. They're going to riot. They're going to vandalize property. They're going to, sometimes sadly, they're going to hurt people. They're going to tar and feather people, which is often fatal. They're going to steal stamps, and throw them in the bay and ruin them, things like that. So there's all these rules that are coming along. There's other ones I could put on here, like the Townshend duties, which is just another tax on lead and paint and different things. These things just keep coming. And every time a new one comes, the American colonists are kind of thinking, I wonder what's going to happen next. And they start saying, we don't think this is fair. We don't think that we should be taxed like this because we're not allowed to say anything. We have no input in any of these taxes. And so we get to, again, the problem of representation as the Americans think about it. They're not, in their minds, they're not being represented equally with other British citizens. In other words, the people in England, they're not being represented the same way. Because remember, no Virginian or New Yorker or anything actually gets put in Parliament in England. It's only English people. And so they then represent all of their colonies all over the world in this kind of virtual way, rather than directly with people from each colony. And you might be saying, well, that doesn't sound fair. You're right. Americans think that's not fair. In fact, that's still how our government works. Every representative must live in the area that they represent. So That's how the whole system works from top to bottom. And again, another lecture, we'll talk about how that system was put together. So in this process, you have some famous people like Patrick Henry, who's another representative from Virginia, and he's the guy who says, "Give me liberty or give me death." And somewhere in this process, he'll say things like, "If I'm a Virginian, so I don't have to pay taxes that aren't put on me by my own legislature." Again, he is buying into this direct representation argument. So Parliament will then say, okay, and they'll pass laws that'll force the Virginia legislature, for example, to raise taxes. They'll pass the Quartering Act, which says the colonies now have to pay for all the troops themselves. Now, they don't get a choice to have troops or not have troops. The government decides that. But then now Virginia or New York or Massachusetts colonies, the governments have to pay for housing and feeding all these troops. So they raise taxes. That's kind of how they get around it. Now in here, and again, you'll see this in that first film, is you'll see this little bit about the Boston Massacre, which occurred in 1770. And I'd like to show this picture. I think this picture, one like it's in your book. This is the picture that Paul Revere made. That's his primary job, was as an artist, and he made pictures. Remember, they don't have cameras back then, so any pictures would be done as an engraving, and then that's how they would print it onto these newspapers. And Paul Revere makes this print immediately following the events of the massacre. And so if you look at this picture, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This picture really tells a story. And the story it tells is that the British decided to line up one day and start shooting the crowd. Except that's not what happened. And the film does an okay job talking about it. But what happened was a tragedy and an accident. And unfortunately, things like this happen more often than you'd think, where crowds and police or crowds and military units get at odds and someone gets killed. And really what's going on is, and this is not a new phenomenon, it's not like this one night the crowd got wild and everything. This happens all the time. It's just this one night people got shot. This was not intentional, but the picture makes it look like it was intentional. You see the captain there with the sword in the air, like they're in a line of battle, like they're going to line up and shoot at soldiers. That's not what's going on. Stuff's being thrown at this soldier. He calls for help. The crowd's yelling at him and cursing at him, and they're probably, some of them are intoxicated, and they're throwing bats and ice, like snowballs and rocks and clam shells or oyster shells and things like that. And these guys get hurt. A gun goes off. Remember, these guns aren't safe. They don't have safeties. They're charged and they're ready to go. And these guys are soldiers, and their job is to shoot things, and that's what they do. That's by default what they do. And I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying this was a tragic accident. But this picture, again, makes it look like a deliberate act. I can tell you, if it was a deliberate act, they would have killed more than 5 people, which is what happened. So, of course, these guys then get detained. And the other part of the story that is not told, while they're vilified by everyone in the colonies, this picture gets put in the newspaper, and basically within a day or two, everyone in America has seen this and believes that the British are gunning down people in the streets, which isn't the case. Well, these guys are now going to court. They're going to be tried by a jury trial in Boston of Bostonians who already believed they're murderers. And so one of the problems they run into is they cannot find a lawyer to represent them. Well, eventually they run across a man named John Adams who hears their story and decides to represent them, and he wins. He realizes that these guys are not murderers, that yes, this shouldn't have happened, but it was an accident. It was a tragic accident, and therefore they're not murderers. Some of them do get in trouble, but no one's hung for murder. So John Adams convinces a jury of Bostonians that legally this is the case. And this is going to pretty much wipe out John Adams's law practice for a while. So a lot of Bostonians are very, very unhappy. But it's the same John Adams who later on will be called to meet in the new Continental Congress as we get closer to 1776, because he's known as a man of the law and a man of integrity. It's the same John Adams who will be a diplomat in England and France and elsewhere. It's the same John Adams who will become our second president and our first vice president. So this is something that seemingly ruins him, but it actually kind of makes him. So as we continue on with feeding the fire, you had the Boston Massacre, and there's kind of a quiet. The government sort of backs off a little bit. But then in 1773, they're going to pass something called the Tea Act, which really gives a monopoly on tea to the East India Trading Company. It actually kind of lowers the tea price, but this actually makes smugglers really angry. Remember, Americans become very good smugglers because they don't like paying all these taxes. They don't like the Navigation Acts. And so now the Tea Act comes along, and they're not really so much protesting the tax part of it, but the monopoly part of it. And they think, well, if the government can give a monopoly on tea, why can't they give a monopoly on other things that we need? And monopoly usually brings the price up, brings the control up for sure. And so, of course, the result here is the Boston Tea Party, where these Americans dress up as Indians and they board these ships in Boston in full view, basically, of everyone, and they dump, a couple $1 million worth of tea into the harbor. And it's this great act of defiance that sort of defines the American Revolution. And what they're doing is they're saying, we're not going to deal with this stuff anymore. And they're just taking it to the next level. Of course, what is Britain's response? The Coercive Act of 1774. So you can see it's just bam, 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 log after log after log after log into this fire, and it's about ready to explode in a big way. So the Coercive Acts come out in 74. They shut down Boston Harbor completely. And what that means is everyone's out of a job, right? The ships, there are no ships coming and going out of the harbor except British naval vessels. Okay, so that affects them. So if your ship's in there, it's stuck. If it's not in there, it can't come back in. Just keep in mind, it's harder to just relocate. But it's not just the ships. Think about the crewmen, the officers, the owners, right? They're not making any money, potentially. Think about the longshoremen who are unloading ships. Well, there's no shipping coming through there. The video is going to tell you it's the third largest port city in the entire British Empire, and they're shutting it down. They're grounding them, effectively, is what they're doing. They're grounding them until they pay back the money that they wasted on destroying the tea. So in a real way, the American Revolution is kind of over tea. So Boston is closed. Again, the longshoremen, what about the warehouse guys and the drivers, the Teamsters? No one's making any money here. This goes all the way back up to the farmers out in the countryside. Where are they going to sell their crops? A few of them might be able to relocate, but most cannot. Just not that simple. So they're stuck. And so basically Boston and Massachusetts go into kind of a depression. The government is basically disbanded, and all these people are looked at as fugitives. These guys are fomenting rebellion. So Massachusetts, Boston becomes this sort of area of rebellion, and the Americans call the Coercive Act the Intolerable Act. So this is now basically come to a point where they feel like they have to respond. And so we get what's called the First Continental Congress. And it met between September 5th and October 26th in 1774. And they didn't do much. They primarily, and I have the word solidarity up here, they primarily established that they are all in this together. So where the Stamp Act Congress might have involved 2 or 3 colonies or a handful of colonies kind of talking amongst themselves, basically it was a think tank to try to deal with some of these issues. But every colony is independent. You and I think of the United States as this big thing. They didn't see themselves as anything but colonies. So I'm a Virginian or I'm a New Yorker. They never really saw commonality with each other until now. The British sort of force it onto them with these laws and taxes and so on. They haven't, other than the Boston Massacre, they haven't really done anything yet. But these representatives from 12 of the colonies, Georgia won't be there this time, but the other 12 American colonies are going to show up, and they're going to meet together and they're going to talk. So that's about, 6 weeks? And they basically resolve that we're in this together and we're going to do a couple things. We're going to try to boycott British goods to force them to change. That does work sometimes. In other words, we're not going to buy sugar, we're not going to buy tea, we're not going to do that. Although that puts you in a real hardship because a lot of those things you need, coffee, sugar, tea, those sort of things, lead, paint, again, things you cannot make yourself. You have to buy them if you want them. And boycotting that's very tough. So there will be some limited success with that. The other thing they're going to do is what's called the petition for redress. They're going to send information to the king, to Parliament, saying, hey, we don't want to be in rebellion. We just want to fix all this to make it right. But what always happens is Parliament throws that kind of stuff in the trash can. They say, well, we don't like your argument, or we don't understand your argument. When the colonists say, we don't feel like we're being represented properly, the Parliament says, I don't understand your problem. You're represented like every other colony is. That's that virtual representation. So they say that's a non-argument. So whenever the Americans complain, when they write letters, I mean, they'll even send Benjamin Franklin and others to England to say, to personally try to communicate these problems. And ultimately, even Ben Franklin will get kicked out of Parliament and told not to come back. At the same time, especially in New England, you're seeing the formation of these Minutemen groups. So they're just militia. We haven't really talked about militia units yet, but militia units are farmers and clerks and just people who are going to band together to defend their town or their village in case there's an emergency. They are not soldiers. They're guys with guns. They're farmers with guns. Now, some of them might have been soldiers from time to time, but they're not soldiers. They're not trained like soldiers. Basically, they meet once every couple of months in the village green. They march around in a circle. They might fire a round off from their gun. Then they go and they collect their pay and they have a beer and then they go back to their lives. It's just more about defending in case of an emergency or a fire or an Indian raid or something like that. So in Massachusetts and other New England colonies, they're going to start training more. So they're still militia, but they're going to train much, much more often so that they're much, much more ready. That's why they're called Minutemen. So they'll be ready in a minute's notice. So they'll start doing that. And of course, the British government knows these things are happening and they're not happy with that. So kind of the last thing on this slide is the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which again will be covered in one of your, I think the first video. This is a battle over really something that shouldn't have been a battle. It wasn't intended to be a battle, but it just sort of happened. And essentially the British are going to hear about a huge stash of weapons that these Minutemen have at a town called Concord, and they will dispatch an entire regiment, that's roughly 800 men, from Boston to march roughly 20 miles to go confiscate all these weapons. Well, along the way, they come up on about 80 armed militiamen in a little town called Lexington. And of course, the British roll up and they unfold into this line of battle formation. And, they got pipes and drums and flags and all these guns. And you've got 80, civilians with guns standing on the other side of the green. And I suspect some of them might have peed their pants here. It was scary. Any sane person would have been scared. And they end up talking for a while. So the whole point of these guys being there was to delay. Well, unfortunately, a gun goes off. This is called the shot heard round the world. Okay? Someone fired a weapon. No one has any idea who it was. The odds are it was an American, but it could have been a British trooper. But honestly, it could have been Farmer John in the farm next door shooting a hog. But it didn't matter. Almost 900 guys with guns are keyed up and nervous. A gun goes off. They start shooting at each other. And naturally, the British end up killing about 8 Americans while the Americans wisely run away. Then they go on to Concord. Of course, the guns have been moved, so the mission was accomplished. Well, now these guys have to march all the way back to Boston. And it's along the way that all these Minutemen and militiamen start popping out and just shooting at them. So it's not a battle where they're going to stand toe-to-toe and duke it out. They're going to do kind of like a guerrilla war where they're going to hide behind trees or rocks or buildings, and they're just going to shoot the British as they're marching back. And they'll kill or wound about a third of that regiment of troops, and about 100 Americans get killed or wounded. So it's, a lot of blood gets spilled, and they'll basically chase them almost all the way back to Boston. So a lot of people have been killed now. No one's declared war. It's still 1774, but things are getting pretty hot, right? Pretty bloody, pretty difficult. Even now, there's no super serious moves to declare independence. That comes later. So then we get the following year, that was, 6 or 8 months later now, May 10, 1775. They're going to convene again because, I see a mistake in my slide. They're going to convene again because this petition for redress and so on are basically ignored, and they realize they got more problems. So they start meeting on May 10th, 1775, and essentially it'll be periodic. About every year they'll elect new people, and they'll have a new process, but they'll meet until March 1781. And in that process, it's supposed to say the de facto national government for most of the war, not the de facto, it's de facto national government. They'll become the government, this Continental Congress, where you have a group of representatives from each of the, at this point, 13 colonies, and then they'll elect a president and a secretary and all that of this group, and they'll talk. And that's mostly what they did in the first Continental Congress, is they talked, they argued. They didn't solve anything, except they got on the same page, they met in the same room where they could hash out their problems together. And that's important because that lends them power, and they can play off each other, and that puts the smart people in the room. And in our case anyway, they were able to move forward and function. So the de facto national government that's just what was there, and so that's what we went with. We do not have the Constitution. That comes much, much later than this period of time. And so it's during the Second Continental Congress, for example, that the Army was formed, June 14th, 1775. So it is true that the Army is a year and a couple of weeks older than the United States, which is kind of weird. Of course, they'll go on to create the Navy and the Marine Corps too. They won't create the Air Force yet. Of course, that'll come later. I think you know why. So they form the Army. They say this army is about defending ourselves against the British. They realize that militia units and Minutemen aren't going to be enough. If it comes to a war, they'll need actual troops. And so they appoint George Washington to be the commanding general of the army. Naturally, remember, he's the war hero. He comes out of the French Indian War as being a guy you can't kill. He's a guy everybody respects. Also, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about has been happening in Massachusetts. He's from Virginia, and so by appointing a Virginian head of the army, that kind of helps weld the north and the southern parts together, right? Now, Washington, of course, is reluctant, but he does take the job. So he'll be the commander-in-chief then, of course, for the duration of the war, and then he will retire. Washington retires a bunch of times, but he keeps getting called back into service, all right? So immediately after he takes over, there's this battle of Bunker Hill where a whole bunch of British and American troops get killed. It's kind of a holding action, I guess, for the Americans, even though a lot of people got killed. The Congress is also going to issue the Olive Branch Petition. It's kind of like the petition for redress, but the Olive Branch Petition says, we're not trying to be in rebellion. We just want to try to correct things. By this point, though, the king will have nothing of it, and he's declaring them all rebels. So, in the meantime, this Boston closure, right, the Coercive Act or the Intolerable Act, has caused Americans under local leadership, and then once the army is formed in June of 75, to actually lay siege to Boston. And you can see it lasts almost an entire year. And a lot of battles, a lot of fighting takes place. Again, Bunker Hill happens in this greater picture of the siege of Boston. And a couple of characters come out of that. Of course, Washington, this is kind of some of his first commands. But Henry Knox, a young 25-year-old bookseller that Washington sees the value of and appoints him to bring all these guns that they had captured several hundred miles away, to bring them to Boston. And Knox does. And Knox, of course, will elevate himself in the entire army structure as well. And ultimately, what happens is the British are forced to evacuate in March of 1776. So while Boston gets closed down, the British are going to leave eventually. Now, they're not going to be that successful in other cities like New York, but Boston will be open, I guess, from that point forward. The little flag you see on here looks strange because of you got the 13 stripes, but you have the British Jack in there. That's the flag they used at this point. We don't have the Betsy Ross flag or any of those things yet. So this is just a recognition of their own flag, but also of basically their British heritage as well. So the Second Continental Congress will, of course, continuously meet for the next number of years. And it's in this context where Virginia Representative Richard Henry Lee offered a resolution that declared the 13 colonies independent. And people kind of heard that. That was on June 7th, 76, and they kind of went, whoa, that's taken a step too far. Although many people have been talking about it, this kind of would make it official. And they decided that if this is going to actually happen, they all need to agree to it. So they took some time to try to get everybody on board because not all of the colonies are on board. So a number of reasons why of course, Massachusetts is on board, Virginia is on board, but you have some other challenges. Pennsylvania, for example, a lot of the people in Pennsylvania, remember, are Quakers, and Quakers are pacifists. There's no way those people are going to vote for independence, which is going to mean war. So that's an issue they have to deal with. New York does not want to vote yes necessarily because they're already occupied by the British. So remember, when they're having these Continental Congress meetings, there are British troops everywhere. British Navy is everywhere, right? So what they're proposing is we got to get rid of the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful empire in the world. We're going to have to push them out of our territory in order to win independence. So they feel like if we go to war, New York's afraid they'll get shut down like Boston was, which is in fact what happens. Other southern colonies like South Carolina, do a lot of business with England, and there's a lot more loyalists in the southern colonies than the northern. Loyalist is someone who remains loyal to the British. A patriot is someone who looks for independence. So there's these are guesstimates, but maybe 1/3 of the people are patriots and 1/3 are loyalists, and maybe the other third are just kind of either in the middle, they don't know or they don't care, or they'll just go whichever way works. So even here, not every American's going to be pro-independence, which is why the British have such good spies and they know what's going on. Well, they'll take about 3 weeks and they will kind of figure it out. I would encourage you to watch the HBO series John Adams, especially the first 2 or 3 episodes. You'll get it takes place during all the stuff that we're talking about. And they give you a great picture of this event. So they'll come back on July 2nd to take the vote. And they still don't know, like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee and all these guys, they don't know exactly how everyone's going to vote. They don't know how New York's going to vote. They don't know how South Carolina's going to vote. When they take the vote, the guy from Delaware is not even in the room. And so it's real difficult, and it's kind of a big risk. So there's a great scene in that documentary where they're doing it. And of course, they start calling the vote. These other colonies are voting yes. Massachusetts votes yes, and so on. And then the Delaware guy pops in and he votes yes. And then they call for Pennsylvania, and there's old Ben Franklin, about 1 million. He's about 70-ish, and he's there, and he kind of pops up and he votes yes. Well, they had asked all the Quakers to stay home that day, knowing that they couldn't vote yes. They sort of called in sick, if you will, and just didn't show up so that Ben Franklin could vote yes. The South Carolina guy, he's super reluctant, but he votes yes. The New Yorker team basically doesn't vote. They abstain. And so what you end up with is 12-4, none against, 1 abstention. The resolution passes. And you'd think everyone would celebrate. The film was great. This documentary or this miniseries, they just kind of sit there and it's super quiet, and they're all kind of staring at the ceiling or looking at each other like, now what? And I think the idea was, we just voted for independence, but we just basically sealed our fate. We're all going to die because the odds of them winning are so small. And so they have now become officially traitors to the British government. And a couple of days later, they will approve the Declaration of Independence. And so that's why July 4th, 1776 is the official date of our birthday. So why did the Declaration of Independence happen? So you have the resolution that they passed there on July 2nd, but in the meantime, they've asked several people, and you see here 3 of them. Thomas Jefferson is the one standing, John Adams is sitting in the middle, and Benjamin Franklin is there on the right. And they asked them and a couple other guys to draft a declaration explaining why we're doing this, why we're brought to this point. But why did they get to the point where they're declaring independence in the first place? So one issue we've talked about some, and that's this idea of taxation and representation. So if they had bumper stickers back then, they would have said no taxation without representation, right? But they don't have bumper stickers back then. They don't even have T-shirts back then, which seems weird, right? But the issue really isn't taxes. They all realize we're going to have to pay some taxes. The issue is how the taxes are coming to them, and that Parliament over there in England, 3,000 miles away, is forcing these taxes on them that they think are unfair, and they have no say in the matter in any way. And so that's where they come up with no taxation without representation. So again, here's the difference between the way they viewed representation, which was in a direct sense, versus the way Britain viewed representation, which is this virtual sense. And so they might talk about representation, but when they're talking about representation, they mean different things. They don't ever understand each other. So one reason is this issue of representation. Another is commerce. So we've had the Navigation Acts, and we've had all these logs thrown on the fire. We have people smuggling. People's businesses are in trouble. People aren't able to make money. And it's all the fault of these laws coming down by the British. And so a lot of people are very, very angry at how all of this is working. Like the last lecture, the colonists realize that they are getting shafted by this whole system. And so they will fight about that. A little book by Thomas Paine called Common Sense was published late in 75. And in that, he essentially argues that there's no reason to have a monarchy. It doesn't make any sense. What makes better sense, and that's why he calls it common sense, is that people who are qualified should be able to govern. The people should choose who they think are qualified to govern them. It shouldn't be based on something as simple as birth. And then the fourth thing is they find out that the British are going to employ Hessian mercenaries. These are German mercenaries. You got to understand there's a real big connection between the British monarchy and Germany. In fact, the Georges are all basically Germans, the 3 Georges. George III, who's the king now, was born in Germany. Lived a long time, lived a lot of his early years in Germany. And these Hessian mercenaries are like professionals. They're like super soldiers. They're the guys the British bring in when they don't care what happens. They're the guys the British send in first to make sure that they win. And these guys are known to be very harsh, very difficult. They rape, they pillage, they steal, and they're basically unbeatable. And when you add all 4 of these things together, the American leadership's now saying, we don't have any choice but to declare independence. And so that's how all those voting and so on comes about. So these guys that you see in the frame are going to, especially Jefferson, are going to be tasked to draft a document. We're not going to read the whole thing, but the famous part of it is this part in the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he goes on to make the case that sometimes the situation is so bad that people have to rebel in order to earn their freedom. And that's the big part of this. So why are these guys asked to write this? Well, Jefferson's already well known to be basically a genius with the pen. He's already written a bunch of stuff, and everyone in the Continental Congress knows that he's the man for the job. They put Ben Franklin in there because, well, he's the old fogey. He's the guy who thinks outside of the box. He's the guy who's seen it all and done it all, and is super smart. And they put John Adams in there because he's the lawyer. He's the guy who's going to have integrity. Not that the others don't, but they know him. He's going to make sure that this thing crosses all the T's and dots all the I's. And again, there's a couple other guys that are going to help. Jefferson's going to write this thing. They're going to make a handful of changes. And we end up with what is arguably one of the greatest documents ever written in history. And that is the Declaration of Independence of the United States. And it's been used then ever since by all kinds of groups and other countries to declare their own independence or their own freedom or to try to get their own rights. So women, Black Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic peoples, Chinese peoples, Asian peoples, even other countries, again, will take this document and they'll use it. They'll reword it a little bit, but they'll use it to make the same point that they're making here. And basically this document is in two parts. You have the beginning part, like we just read, and there's a couple paragraphs there that everybody knows. It's sort of the philosophical explanation for why we're doing this. The rest of the document is a list of all the grievances they have. The government did this thing unfairly. We responded by writing to them. They ignored us. The government did this. We responded, they shot us. And they'll have this long list. So they're basically saying, this is our extreme final straw, and we have to do this. And there's nothing, we don't have a choice. And so we're willing to die if that's the case for our own independence. So that's why this comes about. So that's it for this. Our next lecture is going to be called This Means War. And of course, we're going to talk about the American Revolution.